Hello, Free Speech and the Challenge of Social Media students. Dr. Conway back for Lesson 8 on misinformation and disinformation in social media. This is obviously a very topic, as we're seeing right now, around both COVID and the United States election. I don't imagine that the topic could be much more topical than that at this point. All right, so let's get started on this lesson. Which is an important one because as we move from some of the general concepts and so on in our narrative from the section of the course before our break, we're now moving into some more detailed considerations of the challenges that social media presents for free speech. Is this going to nuance our perspectives on the value of social media for free speech? And that's what we're going into in the second half of the course. Do our perspectives need to be nuanced by less sort of macro concepts like free speech and the importance to democracy and free speech be enhanced by social media? What are now some of the risks that we're looking at when we look at free speech and social media? Some of that came out in your discussion board too, but let's advance this now into a different phase of the course and a different phase of our narrative that really begins to focus now on the challenges of social media to free speech. All right. So on this score, we're dealing with lesson 8 on misinformation and disinformation. We'll cover these 3 topics: how social media empowers misinformation and disinformation, how misinformation and disinformation on social media undercuts public trust in traditional journalism, prominent tactics of misinformation and disinformation in social media. Let's look at some of these things, all right? How social media empowers misinformation and disinformation, preying on vulnerabilities and bias. And we'll talk about that now. We noted in lesson 2 of our course, disinformation refers to deliberate attempts to confuse or to manipulate people through delivering information that is purposefully not factual or true. Okay, disinformation campaigns are typically designed to attack the reputations and trustworthiness of individuals or groups, or to discredit rivals and so on, diminish trust in public institutions via, for example, unsubstantiated claims about voter fraud, corruption, etc. We're seeing a lot of that going on in the United States from one of the candidates there, right? Promote conspiracy theories to build angst and general uneasiness in segments of the population. COVID-19 planted by the USA military, or experts about COVID-19 are really just trying to control us, or and so on and so forth. All right. And we all see that. Confuse public understanding of important public issues by misusing facts or fabricating alternative facts. All right. The climate change debate is a classic example of that. All right. Ridicule the public's respect for expertise, typically by making claims that try to place experts in positions of supposed self-interest. For example, we have Donald Trump saying that doctors may make more money when people are diagnosed with COVID or die from COVID. These types of disinformation campaigns it's not like they're rare anymore, right? I mean, they're wide open in the public eye. Okay. Misinformation, as you'll recall, is information that is false but not created with intention of causing harm, albeit it can subsequently be circulated with harmful intentions by other people. This can occur through poor quality journalism, right? Including clickbait headings to attract internet traffic. We learned about clickbait headings and opinion articles that, while not intended disinformation, provocatively seek to drive traffic primarily through sensationalist interpretations or cherry-picked facts or events. All right, and this is also wide open, and we can see this on a regular basis on social media. Information generated and circulated outside quality traditional journalism without requisite expertise and knowledge, right? We have various fake news outlets that come up onto the internet, right? Or highly partisan organizations try to portray themselves as being objective journalists, right? All of these things, we see these in post-millennial newspaper, all different kinds of things are out there, right? that demonstrate this. We can no longer claim this does not exist. It's in our face all the time. It exists, right? It can be validated 100 times over, all right? Comments on e-newspaper articles that try to reinterpret facts and truth to suit the commentator's bias, suppress the opinions of others who are not in agreement, and evoke emotional responses to distract people from facts and truth. And we'll learn more about that, the emotional and psychological dynamics of social media in our next lesson, all right? Both disinformation and misinformation present serious challenges for all countries, but are especially problematic for open democratic societies for the reasons we talked about in the first half of the term, right? Disinformation tends to be the most dangerous because it is deliberately false created to harm a person, social group, organization, or country. Okay, and disinformation campaigns are typically more highly organized, right? They're purposeful, right? Well-funded and reinforced by sophisticated understanding of search engine optimization, whether that be the Russian troll factories, the Chinese troll factories, the Iranian troll factories, or bias within the security establishments of democratic countries, right? This isn't a one-edged sword, although the preponderance tends to be coming from disruptive forces, all right? Extensive use of troll armies as a tool to suppress opposition to disinformation and misinformation, to create alternative and often confusing narratives, right? Fake likes is a classic example of that, right? Where somebody will say something outrageous and the troll army will come in and hit the like button 50 times, right? As if that provides value, substantiation to the quality of the information. One of the first things that anybody learning about social media literacy is that likes mean nothing. All right, but it's hard to convince young people, for example, that that's the case. The intent being to try to suppress a contrary opinion, right? By saying, look at how many people like this and you must be wrong, right? When likes don't mean that at all. Likes mean that somebody has an agenda in most cases. Not in all, but in most cases when you're dealing with troll armies, all right? Automated technology, a computer artificial intelligence known as bots. Some people mention bots in their discussion comments, right? To spread much higher volume of disinformation at targeted populations virtually every day around the clock, right? Bots were a significant problem during Brexit, during the 2016 election in the United States, continue to be a very serious concern, right? All these tactics have as a common objective to prey on the vulnerability or bias of recipients who show promise to be enlisted as amplifiers and multipliers. The only way that disinformation campaigns work is they have to recruit people in social media to become amplifiers and multipliers of the disinformation. That's how conspiracy theories like QAnon work, right? They don't work by them sort of botting out a whole bunch of contacts. They rely on the fact that they're fishing. It's like a fly fisherman, right? They need to catch an amplifier and a multiplier. And the more amplifiers and multipliers they can hook, the more this will travel around social media around the planet. All right? Okay. And what is the implication of all this? Well, one of the implications has been undercutting public trust in traditional print journalism. Fake news are just something we agree with, right? We disagree with. Fake news are just something we disagree with, right? For example, President Trump will use the term fake news, right? But what he really means is news that doesn't fit the way he wants to look at a subject matter, all right? He's not the only one, but he's the most prominent actor, so I use that as an example right now. All right, so and so the concept of fake news was brought into the limelight in the 2016 U.S. election, right? Even the Pope came out and criticized fake news, right? This has placed the term of fake news in repertoire tactics for political distraction and spin around the world, right? But because fake news is often misused as a political ploy by basically labeling something fake news, despite the fact that it's completely substantiated in fact and truthfulness, we call it fake news anyway because we disagree with it, right? So we don't use the term fake news in taking a more scientific approach to these questions of free speech and social media. Instead, we use the more generic terms or the more objective terms of misinformation and disinformation. Okay, but we cannot deny the effects that social media is having on traditional print journalism as this has gone on. Because as social media generates more and more stories, that some truthful, some misinformation, lots different disinformation, journalism finds itself having to compete with this high volume, high frequency, traffic that's selling itself as news when it may or may not be news, right? And the more emotional and extremist it becomes, the louder it yells, the more attention it gets. So journalism is caught in traditional print journalism is caught in the vortex of having to compete with that. Either stay sort of objective, factual, and dry, or rise the volume of your statements as well to match and to garner attention in social media. And this has had significant implications for the way traditional print media conducts itself, and the way traditional print media's respect in the public has gone down as a result. Now print media is seen as just another loud voice, or another voice that has extremist clickbait, or cherry-picked clickbait, or whatever, like any other social media source. So now they've just become part of the pool rather than having their own swimming pool. All right. And the implications of this was, firstly, paid newspaper subscriptions have decreased substantially over the past decade as traditional print media buyers decided to avoid paying for what they could get for free, quote unquote, over the internet, as if these are equivalencies. All right. And in some cases they are, but in many cases it's much easier for misinformation and disinformation to travel through social media than it is through the formal fact-checking processes of print media until recently. And print media has also started to change. It started to change from investigative journalism to opinion journalism. And you can see that now. The prominent articles in a lot of newspapers these days are opinion articles. They're not investigative journalism, okay? Secondly, the decline in prescription revenue led to a considerable drop-off in newspaper and magazine revenue, right? These developments have substantially contributed to social media platforms occupying more of people's time relative to traditional print media, and thus being more influential over the types of information that people are exposed to. So the print media has to try to compete with that, right? A second result is a substantial decline in investigative journalism, as I just mentioned, which in the past served as a counterweight to misinformation and disinformation. Because to compete with the speed and the volume of information that people are getting on social media, print media needed to change its business model to account for that. So articles became more easier to generate, less investigative journalism, which is expensive because their subscription revenue went down. So that went down. So opinion pieces became more common in print journalism, and people began to say, well, this is just another opinion piece, right? So print journalism loses a lot of its currency in battling misinformation and disinformation. A third result is the ascendance of opinion journalism, as I mentioned, that can be written without ever leaving the office, and typically is, and in many ways is closer to tabloid journalism than traditional reporting, right? The age of the famous, investigative journalists like Bob Woodward and these types of people, right? The mythical investigative journalism, the investigative war reporter, all of that. Where are those guys now? They're a dying breed, right? And as journalism has shifted more and more to this kind of small story reporting that can be factual, but the substantial heading pieces typically tend to be opinion pieces now. All right. If you look at any major newspaper in Canada now, and you use Google News, the pieces that come up will typically be opinion pieces, right? Which don't use a lot of factual substantiation. They're not investigative journalism pieces. They're opinion pieces. All right. For these reasons, traditional print media is now more exposed than ever to claims of fake news, as they've had to shift this way, right? Attacks need not be based on any discoveries of factual errors in journalism, but rather are designed to inflame an emotional response amongst followers. So sometimes, opinion pieces will just highlight the opinion of one segment of the population to try to fire them up, to try to attract them to the article, to try to get them to click on their website, to try to move forward opinions. So print journalism becomes very much mimicking the same tactics that social media media uses to rise above the noise, to be the thing that people click on when they only have so much time to click on so many things. It's your job, if you're a social media promoter, to make sure one of those clicks comes to you. How do you do that? More outrageous claims, more extremist opinions, more so on, attract clicks. That is without question. All right. So President Trump's, for example, infamous and oft-repeated enemies of the people claim is a prominent example of an effort to suggest bias in the media and in the traditional print media. And the traditional print media has opened itself up to that. All right. That's why you can have CNN as a liberal broadcaster and Fox News as a conservative broadcaster, right? Not necessarily broadcasting factual information, but broadcasting information that tailors to the clientele that they're serving, which is very much what social media does, isn't it, right? But print media and television media has moved in this direction largely because of the pressure of social media. And that has brought traditional journalism into some question and some disrepute in democratic systems, which can be very dangerous, okay? Journalists have always been the targets of intimidation in authoritarian countries and war zones, but we're also seeing that now in democracies. There's been an alarming increase in attacks despite the important role of the free press in democracy. Right? We've seen this, and it's because they're more open to attack because they're now playing in the same pool where everybody else is attacking each other, rather than creating the perception of an objective, analytical approach to a news story. Okay? All right, so that has major implications. When we're talking about free speech and democracy, right, and the challenge of social media to free speech and democracy, you cannot consider that without looking at the impacts that social media has had on traditional journalism, which has been fundamental and substantial. All right. So what are the tactics for promoting misinformation and disinformation on the internet, and things that we constantly need to look for to determine whether we should trust the source or not trust the source, right? And here are some classic tactics of disinformation primarily, but also misinformation, right? And that one is distorting facts, right? This can occur with deceptive headlines or reinterpretations of a story in another write-up. It's quite common in social media. The tactic is to cherry pick and exaggerate elements of a story as if they are the preponderance of that story, all right? And this is a classic example, right? Which we saw down in the U.S. with Dr. Fauci, said one element in a long statement that he was making. That was cherry picked out to show that Dr. Fauci was apparently supporting the Trump administration's approach to COVID-19, which we know is completely in fact factually incorrect, right? But was able to cherry pick a fact and bring it forward as if, and distorting that fact out of context to portray a message which was clear disinformation. All right. Stated another way, one or two facts are taken out of context and given weight far and away beyond their significance to the facts of the story as originally reported. This is a common tactic. All right. Like, there was a protest, and there was a percentage of the protest that were black Canadians, and the story then becomes that all about the black Canadians that were at the protest rather than the overall context of the protest. It's a common tactic. It's used all the time. It's used all the time, often against minority groups, okay, Indigenous peoples and so on. It's very, very commonly used, and we have to watch for it when we're using social media, right? One example would be, for example, a person who attended a political event because it was their job, right? Okay, they were there. A story then states that the person attended the event, a fact, and it just so happens someone else was there, and no doubt they were up to something underhanded, right? Sounds very simplistic, but this is a lot of what gets done when you're trying to create disinformation on social media. So we have to look for it. We have to defend. This conversation is quite apart from whether you want to restrict free speech on social media or not. These are the things to be aware of if you don't control free speech on social media, so that you don't become victim to misinformation and disinformation. All right? That's all I'm saying here. Right? I'm not making a position that this automatically means we go to regulating social media, but it does mean that we go automatically to making sure we protect ourselves from being abused by misinformation and disinformation. Opinions presented as facts. This is a common thing that traditional media has gone to now to be able to compete with social media with lots of opinion pieces. It's very common now, right? Opinions are often presented as facts when no substantiation has been provided. This occurs in many different guises, including in traditional print media, as I said, particularly in opinion articles. A common tactic here is to say something in passing, implying that it is a fact, when the evidence for that is not in evidence anywhere in the current article, or perhaps has never been in evidence. All right? So an opinion article would say, well, obviously the Liberal government wants to do this to us. And then it moves right on to talk about how bad all things are and so on. And you're sitting there kind of going, okay, I can respect your political perspective, but if you're going to say that it's obvious that this is the case, then how about, demonstrating that it's obvious through some factual substantiation? And so we have to defend ourselves against this, even in the traditional print media now, because the traditional print media has really become enveloped by social media. All right? Many subscriptions now to traditional media are actually digital, right? No longer is it, do I get my newspaper at the front door? I use digital, right? Which then makes it part of the social media milieu. And we have to accept that social media has a fundamental impact on traditional media. Manipulating research data is another tactic. This is a common tactic to try to discredit legitimate research and its conclusions. It is used extensively when a source wants to introduce scientific uncertainty into an issue that has already been proven in science. Studies are presented with highly suspect or purposefully contrived methodologies to try to present a quote-unquote alternative finding, as if it is on the same par as the legitimate research. They can do this because the people reading it are not experts in the subject area, not experts in the methodology to come to conclusion. So, so what these guys said so-and-so, but if you look at if you're sophisticated enough to look at the methodology and the qualifications of the other group, you quickly realize that this is largely a disinformation or a misinformation campaign. Okay, we have seen this tactic used heavily in the area of climate change research, but also in vaccinations, cannabis legalization, etc. Right? When opposing parties that have an economic interest or a political interest purposefully try to introduce scientific uncertainty into something where there's already a lot of legitimate scientific consensus. Okay? Referencing the media or other credible sources to pretend legitimacy. This is a common tactic. To cherry pick facts from a credible source and then weave them into stories entirely out of context. I just gave you the example of Dr. Fauci and the Trump administration. Or they are given a weight vastly out of proportion to the evidence of the original reporting. Credible sources can be legitimate media or research paper from research institutes or government bodies. For example, legitimate media reports might have pointed to reports of some people doing X, but then a misinformation or disinformation source suggests that the vast majority of people are doing X, or people of a certain ethnic group are doing X. All right? So this is so X has been established, but now the story weaves the preponderance of something else against that fact. So the fact provides legitimacy, original legitimacy, but the rest of the article takes that fact completely out of context. A very common tactic in reporting on social media. Okay, the use of false comparison is another example of misinformation and disinformation. This tactic is typically used to advance false equivalencies. This effort usually starts with a known as a whataboutism. Okay, this can be seen in drawing comparisons between events that have an entirely different backdrop and context, or an entirely different purpose and scale of actions, and then concluding they were doing it too, or why is it okay for them and not for us? Which is a completely dishonest comparative envelope for that, right? This tactic was perhaps most prominently used, at least recently, in Charlottesville, right? When neo-Nazis marching in the streets led to clashes with counter-protesters. The president and his extremist supporters heavily deployed whataboutisms and false equivalencies to distract from the reality of Nazism in the USA's own backyard. Okay? False expertise. This is a classic example. when you're trying to, introduce, it's related to introducing scientific uncertainty. But it's a common tactic. It was heavily used to fight climate change action. This tactic typically has an author or speaker imply, without substantiation, a wide range of credentials, as if that will justify their opinion as being credible. All right? The credentials are usually fake, loosely related to the subject at hand, or unrelated to the subject at hand entirely. It might be a PhD, but it's a PhD in a completely unrelated area. There's nothing in that person's CV that would indicate that they have any special expertise in this area. I have a PhD, right? I write an article that says that, this theory on brain surgery is not the right way to go. Well, yeah, I have a PhD, but I'm not a brain surgeon, right? Or the credentials are completely mocked up, right? Completely fake. That happens often. So these are imagined experts, pseudo-expert, misrepresented experts. Common tactic. Okay, the tactic has two goals: to raise doubt about the real experts, or to discredit expertise in general. And we've seen this in COVID, right? We've seen this in COVID-19 around the world. Nobody really knows because experts disagree, or the experts change their message from 6 months ago to today. No reference to the fact that the circumstances have also changed in those 6 months, or our knowledge has accumulated in those 6 months, leading to the reason for the change in advice, right? No, the only thing they'll point out is that there was a change in advice. So it's a fact taken completely out of context, stated by people who do not have the expertise to comment on the subject matter. We've seen this in COVID-19. We can point to hundreds of examples. So what I'm saying, we can substantially support what we're saying. With computer, and then there's photo and video manipulation, which is very dangerous, right? Where we have, deep fake videos now. Because seeing is believing, right? Now social media has taught us that seeing is no longer believing. Or you should not be believing purely out of seeing. But we also have to recognize that photo manipulation and video manipulation has now become a common tactic on social media, all right? And it's a very dangerous tactic, all right? Whether that be cutting clips out of one video and putting it out of context in another video, or superimposing a person's face and voice on a video where they were never there. All of these kinds of things are now occurring on social media. And if we have to protect ourselves from misinformation and disinformation, we have to be acutely aware of these things, right? We can't just pretend they don't exist. They exist in enormous numbers now on social media, okay? So on that, I'm going to conclude for this lesson. We'll be back to you next time for the lesson on social psychology of social media, and that should be a very interesting topic for many of you. Okay? Take care for now. Bye-bye.